Hi, this is your host Swapnil Bhartiya and welcome to another episode of TFR Let's Talk. And today we are here at Open Source Summit in Dublin and we have with us once again Stefano Maffulli. You are Executive Director at the Open Source Initiative or OSI as we all know. What is OSI's role in today's world where open source has already become very, pervasive?
Open source is everywhere, and we have done a very good job at convincing and creating this ecosystem where everything is smooth and very easy to use and understood. There are very simple rules of engagement. And we maintain, as the Open Source Initiative, we maintain a list of licenses that once they've been approved and vetted by the community, they are clearly defined, they're clearly understood, and corporations can use them. The problem comes from the fact that the business models that are enabled or prevented from some of these licenses are not well understood. And there are two different things. So the confusion stems from there.
There are two kinds of companies that I look at, organizations. One is that, of course, companies who have been around for like hundreds of years. Some of those big companies, they do understand open source and they have program offices, they have very good open source strategy in place. And then there are new companies who are coming in there. But in both cases, there are still a lot of companies, established companies, they are still struggling because they have so much legacy backlog or workforce that is kind of challenged to move their IP to open source, even if they want to. And then there are a lot of new companies who are still, as you pointed out, that they are juggling between the business model. So sometimes they look at open source as a business model. Hey, if I can make the code secret, I may have so we see the problem. So which of these two you look at a bigger challenge?
The bigger challenge is reaching out to this company and helping them understand, so doing education with the companies and with society as a whole. Because there is still a lot of work that needs to be done also on the policy side, on the policymakers, to help them and understand. Because with software, open source software being so common and so pervasive, it's also everywhere, in people's pockets, it's in banks, it's running airplanes, and this shared source code also shares common problems, common bugs, common issues. And finally, regulators around the world are realizing how much of a challenge that is, and how much challenge there is in software in general. And so they're starting to regulate and starting to paying attention. Our job and our big challenge is now to educate the public and educate policymakers to understand open source from the perspective of the collaboration and with the competition in mind too.
How much do you think governments are aware of the importance of open source? Because sometimes they do want to have full control over the code. That is sometimes even powering military applications.
I think that they know a lot more than we give credit them for. Especially, well, not especially, everywhere. Right? From China, Japan, all the way to the other side of the oceans and landmass, all around the world. The policymakers are paying attention to open source. There are governments like the Italian government, French, but also in the United States, agencies that have a very good understanding of what open source is, the definition of open source, the meaning of the licenses, the mandate, some of the licenses, and finally, what we have seen with the Biden administration has been exactly that final realization of a long history of growing importance of the open source movement. And I think it's a welcome evolution.
Are there any new technologies or new use cases that you are worried about because they are not embracing open source to an extent where you would feel they should use?
I'm definitely looking at new technology. We are looking at artificial intelligence as of today, as of this year's focus. But in the context of understanding how these new technologies challenge the principles and the definition of open source. Because we have to keep in mind the fact that when open source started to exist, it was because software was starting to exist. It was a new technology that was not being, for the first time, was being sold as an entity on its own. Copyright was applied to it, and instead of patents law, for example, there were decisions being made. And at the time, the GNU Manifesto was written as a basis for how the software industry or nascent software industry needed to be treated and needed to be treat each other and needed to treat the users and the developers of those systems. The open source definition came after the shared understanding about the rules of these rules of engagement. When now that we have AI that is coming out of the research labs, we need to do the same sort of analysis. We need to look at each other. We need to understand better what are the rules of engagement. This thing can do damages, can be very helpful and effective. How do we build it together? What shall we look out for? And governments are doing the same thing with AI, but blockchain is another place, is another environment where the concepts of software distribution, software execution are not the same that were in the 80s when the open source and free software movement started to define the principles of operation.
You talked about the new of 4 freedoms, or you folks have like I think 10 or something like similar to that. Yeah. So, but the fact is that those whether you talk about 4 freedom of GNU or you talk about OSI's definitions, that was all written for the age when software was distributed, and now we are not distributing. Even you are supposed to give the source code when you are giving the code itself. But now we live in a cloud era where the software is running in the cloud, so I'm not distributing anything. So I'm not even, kind of compelled to go out and give. So do you feel that, because, and, if you look at GNU, they came out with version 3, which was not, depending on who you talk to, some people appreciated it, some people did not appreciate it, some people use it, AGPL is also there, which a lot of folks don't touch. Right. So do you also feel that we need the evolution of license itself also? Because a lot of companies, they get worried about, hey, those cloud vendors will come and take, because they are sometimes use the license as a weapon, as a business tool, which is not right. So do you feel that we do need to define because the use cases are changing?
I agree with you. There's not a lot of answers to the question of now distribution is happening over wires and through consumption of software is happening through API calls on remote services. So does that really apply to, and how does that apply to the principles and of open source? And we haven't really had that conversation. I think we should be offering a little bit more options than simply the Affero GPL v3 for companies that want to have a sustainable business, build a sustainable business models out of open source software.
They all love open source, BSD, MIT, Apache, but the moment you talk about AGPL, nope, because it's so pervasive. They're like, it will touch, it doesn't know what it will touch. So they're like, no, we are not going to, I talk to them, they're like, AGPL, nope. So the thing is, we also have to understand what industry is comfortable with, because we have made them comfortable to start open sourcing things. Suddenly we don't want to force them, hey, then they will start pulling back.
I think that when the business models as a service started to emerge and consumer consumption of software was starting to be happening through the wires, the fact that we only have one license that follows those, tries to adapt the open source principles strictly with copyleft behind over the wire, it could be, I think it's a little bit of a limitation. It's something more that requires, I would really hope to see a little more conversations about how we can support business models that are happening as a service with licenses that are respectful of the principles of open sourse.
Deb Bryant is joining, as the U.S. policymaker. First of all, talk about the role that is involved there and why you felt that you needed a U.S. policy, role.
No, that's a great. I'm super excited to have Deb back on the OSI roster. She was a board member before, and we just needed to have someone inside the United States to help with helping the policymakers. There is a lot of interest from all sorts of agencies at very different levels, from the local governments to the federal government, and they need to be educated to understand what happens inside open source. What is open source? What are the licenses? How to set up collaboration? How to interface with vendors that are offering? What demands they can have towards vendors themselves? And that helps on the software procurement side also. They need to understand how to be safe, how to be secure, how to respect the licenses. So we're going to be working, she's going to be working with the agencies themselves, but directly, but also with partners. And so we're going to be providing our expertise, our 25 years of experience in doing open source with these governments, because in the end the governments are us. They're expression of our tax-paying money and our wills as voters and citizens, and therefore we need to help them to do the right thing for us.
You folks are also organizing a deep dive AI event. Talk a bit about that event and why you felt the need. Is this the first event by OSI or?
It's not the first event by OSI, but it's definitely an innovative format for an event where we have it split into three. It's online and it's split into three parts. The first part is a podcast series that we just finished releasing this week. 5 episodes, interviews with experts of AI to introduce the topics. And then the panel discussions will happen with more experts in October. And then finally we will publish a report or proceedings of what we discovered. And the reason why we're doing this is because AI is changing the way software is interpreted or understood. Concepts like software source code in a large AI system is not really clear. So we need to understand what the researcher community, what the business community, what the legislator and the society and the legal community, what they understand so far, and start laying down the guidelines and guardrails for ethical collaboration, ethical uses of the AI systems, knowing that these automated decision makers, because that's what an AI in the end is, they can do quickly a lot of damage and scaling up very quickly, so can get out of control. And in order to control the digital space and these decision makers, we need to be able to understand what we need to demand if, for example, we get denied a loan or we get put to jail because an AI decided that the picture that we sent to our doctors is misinterpreted as child abuse or something like that. This is a recent story.
I look forward to that event. Stefano, thank you so much for sitting down with me and talk about this very important but not very comfortable topic, because it's a very sensitive topic as well. So thanks for taking those questions, and as usual, I would love to have you back on the show. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you.